Good now? All right. So again, welcome, and thank you for taking the time. I know that when you start days like this at 8 in the morning and you're going through educational sessions all day long, you're probably at that point in your day where your head's about to explode and you're not quite sure anything more is going to fit. So we'll try to make this interesting, and hopefully we'll have some fun together along the way. Kathy mentioned that she would take the microphone around if you have questions, but I'm not going to let you off the hook. You're going to have questions. We're going to have to talk a little bit about some of these issues as we go along. So don't be surprised if she even makes it over to the far corner and is looking for comments along the way. So public trust and confidence is an issue that has been around and talked in NACM circles since 1985, when we founded NACM. There's a few of us left that are charter members, and we've been looking at these issues over and over and over again over the years. But it's a real thing that affects how we do our business on a day-to-day basis, and also what people think about us in the courts. So we're going to try to go through this. When I was asked to do the session, they asked me to break it up into 2 different hours. And I wanted to make sure everybody understood that the actual curriculum that's set up for public trust and confidence is set for a 15-hour course. And there are 11 specific learning objectives that are built in to those 15 hours. So what I'm trying to do is condense this into 2 hours and give you a quick high-level overview of some of the things that are included in the competency. But what I really hope you will do is go back when you have a chance and you're back at your court, and you'll download the competency itself. It is a document that's laid out for you. Hopefully it's easy to read. These 7 sections are laid out in the competency. So in the first hour, we went through the overview. We went through some of the historical perspective that goes back to the Magna Carta, that takes us through the Federalist Papers, takes us through Roscoe Pound's speech in 1906 about public trust and confidence in the courts, right up looking at our constitutional provisions and where we are today with a lot of these issues. We talked about the impact of effective court process, how well we do our day-to-day jobs, and what that leans into in terms of working with the public. And then we started looking at the issue of procedural fairness. So I'm going to start off there in a moment and touch on a few more things dealing with procedural fairness, but then we're going to look at some ideas about a systemic approach to court management, how you do jurisdictional assessments on public trust and confidence, and then we'll wrap up at that point. So my hope is that what you'll get and you can take home with you is something tangible that you can use, whether you're teaching from the curriculum, whether you're using one of the exercises with your staff, whether you're doing some outreach to the public. There are a lot of different things that you can find in this competency that may help you out along the way. But what I need everyone to do first is take out your phone. And what I'd like you to do is go to a browser. Chrome seems to work best, but others will work too. And enter kahoot.it. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And I'm going to try to switch over. And I need to end one game and start another one. That was from our last one, and I want to play a new game. And what's going to happen in a moment is you're going to see a code, a numerical code, come up on your screen. And it's loading now, so hopefully you've found Kahoot. And there's a number at the top of the screen in front of you. If you enter that number into your browser, It will take you directly to the game. Our folks that are on the live stream that might be watching this can do this from anywhere in the world. And you can see name. It'll ask you for a nickname or a name. I'll start. I'm going to give you a few seconds and see if we can get more people in here, because it always makes it a little more interesting. And then I like some of the, kind of interesting that somebody has a nickname of jurisprudence. So I never thought about that as a nickname before. So we got 21 players right now. See if anyone else is going to join us. If 22 players, anybody else need a moment? If not, we'll go ahead and start. So there are 2 questions that are loading, and the first question is, how engaged is your state Supreme Court or AOC with improving public trust in the courts? So on your phone, you should see 4 colors pop up with the symbols on it. So red if you have no clue and it's never discussed. Blue if you're very engaged with multiple programs. Oh, you guys are quick. All right, so we've got quite a range here. I won't call anyone out and ask which one of your Supreme Courts are on the no clue side. But as you can see, there's a broad range with most of the folks coming up with very engaged in multiple programs. So what that says to me is that everyone who answered that way and selected the blue option, you've got something to share with the rest of us sitting here. There are programs out there that are underway that you might be able to help out me and other colleagues with, and so think about how you might be able to share that, because if we can make sure that we've got some assistance along the way and we don't have to start many of these programs from scratch that we're going to talk about, it helps to know that there is that support. So let's see. I think I've got another question built in here for you. So if money and time were no object, what would you recommend to improve public trust in the courts? Would you eliminate all filing fees and court costs? Establish legal self-help centers? Provide more ODR? Provide public defenders in all cases, not just criminal cases? What would you do? So let's see what happens as the answers come in. Wow. All right. So immediate responses we get here, and it looks like we've got a couple of folks interested in eliminating filing fees and costs. I know there are a lot of litigants that come into my court that would love to hear that, to say it's a free service, come on in, let's help you out, resolve your disputes. ODR is an issue that continues to grow. Public defenders, we got a little vote for, but obviously the most is legal self-help centers. So let me ask you, for those of you that answered that way, what do legal self-help centers do in your jurisdiction? Because as I see them, they are not all created the same. They do different things in different places. So help me out here. Who's willing to share a little bit about what happens in your jurisdiction and how you think it affects public trust and confidence? Here's a microphone for you.
It helps people, litigants that are confused and
Okay.
Don't have the education to navigate through what is often a very scary legal system.
Yeah.
People come to court and they're nervous, they're concerned, they really don't know how to navigate those waters, and self-help services will help with that.
Okay. So the concept of some kind of legal navigator to help people through. That's a great example. What are some other things? We've got a hand right in the back here.
We just opened a week ago our self-help center, modeled after, I'm in a juvenile court, so modeled after the downtown court. And we have a friendly staff that is there at all times. Our mediators, part of them are within our self-help center. And we have kiosks with computers and forms and access, so they can email their public defender or their attorney or their
So do you mind if I pick on you for a moment while you have the microphone? Tell us a little bit about how did you decide what was going to be offered there? You just opened it up. You know, was it just, you know, divine inspiration? Was it focus groups? Was it clients? How did you decide that?
Well, it wasn't overnight for sure.
Okay.
The downtown court spent a lot of time doing focus groups and talking to the clients that come into the court, the clients that came into what was then officially the law library, to the attorneys that have clients come looking for things, to self-represented litigants. And so we didn't reinvent the wheel. We took all of that information. We met with the folks that were developing the one downtown, and then, you know, watched how that got developed, what happened there,
Mm-hmm.
and what kind of successes and lessons were learned, and continue to work with them very closely. They've been just amazing. And then when, you know, it's a much smaller scale, but we piggyback on the technology, we piggybacked on the types of questions that were being brought into the resource center, and then we tried to also talk to our own attorneys that work in the juvenile court to say, what do your clients need? We talked to our other
Okay.
stakeholders. What do your clients need? The Department of Child Safety, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And just tried to provide accessibility. It's right there on the first floor when you walk in the door. Our judges, we've met with our judges. They all kind of have a little script that says, you know, that's a great question. Walk across the lobby, you go to the resource center, and
Perfect.
we can help you.
All right. So it sounds like a lot of thought went into that to try to engage people that may need to use those court services, and then you built it accordingly. Anyone else do anything significantly different? Judge, please.
Yes, hi Kevin. Thank you for the narrative about the juvenile court. We're the downtown court. I'm Kyle Bryce, presiding judge of Pima County, and we retrofitted and repurposed our law library, as you just heard a moment ago, into a self-help and resource center. And we've had a great amount of input and help from the community as well. And among the other things that we've done, in addition to setting up kiosks and having forums, and folks there help direct people into certain areas where they need to do research, things like that. We've partnered with Southern Arizona Legal Aid and with two other nonprofit entities, Step Up to Justice and the Pima County Bar Foundation. And they offer daily courses, daily advice
Nice.
sessions. And it's gotten so popular that at this point, whereas our initial thought was we'd have folks available on a walk-in basis to talk to these folks that need advice and guidance, there is such a demand that there are now setting appointments 2 weeks out. So the demand is there, and we're doing our best to meet that demand and expand at the same time, while not losing sight of our core function and core purpose. That core purpose is, of course, is to make sure that we've got a place for folks to do research too. So there's an attorney area, a client area where folks can go and get access to the internet. We have probably 30 computers now, with more on the way.
Very nice. Thank you.
One last thing.
Please.
We modeled it after Maricopa County. I have to tell you.
Yeah. So one of the things that we can do, that's one of the benefits of being NACM members and attending conferences, is hearing what's going on in a lot of different jurisdictions around the country. These are a couple of examples, and we'll probably talk about more before the afternoon's over. But hopefully you can latch onto some of these ideas, maybe follow up with folks, and see where it goes next. So I think I've got to make sure I end this for a change, and then we'll get into another one in a few minutes. All right. So part of what I wanted to do with that is to just get us thinking about public trust and confidence, things that we can do, how we might be able to do that better, and share a little bit among ourselves as we go along, and we'll do some more of that this afternoon. When We worked in the first session. A few of you folks were here during the first hour, but just to bring folks along, I wanted to take a look at this fourth section again a little bit more about the emergence of procedural fairness in the courts. So this is an area where there's a lot of resources that are built in to the core competency, into the curriculum itself. But one of the things that I tried to do here that you can take a look at on your own if you'd like is to find a number of video clips from around the country, from different states, that showed different concerns that may have arisen with public trust and confidence and with procedural fairness. So there's one that we looked at in the last hour that is an incident that happened with the Wisconsin Supreme Court that threw people for a loop. And there's others, including one, some of you might have seen it. There was an unfortunate situation in, I think it was in Virginia, where there was a visiting judge. It might have been Pennsylvania or Virginia, but they got frustrated with a self-represented litigant who was in the courtroom and asked him to stop talking, and asked him again to stop talking, and asked him a third time to start talking, and then called the bailiff over and basically said, tase him, light him up. And this was on the court recording, and the defendant was tased and was screaming in the courtroom and then basically dragged out. So, you know, there are a number of different situations. There's good things that we do in the courts all the time that don't get publicized, but you have those one, like in this short video clip, the newscaster is talking about a fight that broke out. It almost got into a fist fight with a couple of justices in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I mentioned that in Michigan several years ago. I wouldn't have probably said it out loud if I hadn't seen it myself, but it was at a time when I was still working with the Supreme Court, and there was a food fight that broke out among the justices in the conference room. I mean, it was pretty ugly. You know, I just didn't expect that to happen, but that's one of the things that has occurred from time to time. So the question becomes in this curriculum is, what does that do for public trust and confidence in the courts? And if we know that some of those unfortunate things happen from time to time, is there something that we can do at the other end of the spectrum to bring people along and help them better understand what we do, who we are, and how can we do a better job with them to inspire public trust and confidence? And that's where procedural fairness comes in. There's a lot of research that has been done. One professor, Tom Tyler, has, I think he was at New York University when he started on this, and has done quite a bit more. Do we have anyone from Minnesota here? I'm not seeing any hands. We have a judge in Minnesota, Kevin Burke, who served a few years ago on the NACM board and has written and taught about procedural fairness. So there's a lot of information that has already been developed and is available to any of you if you wanted to take a look at it or share it with people in your jurisdiction. But it comes down to these four areas that are highlighted here that we did talk about in the last hour, looking at giving people a voice in the process, making sure we're showing how we're neutral and independent decision makers. You know, again, something that probably all of our mothers taught us somewhere along the line is to treat people with respect. And we think it's common sense, but it doesn't always come across that way. So that's an important piece, and making sure that we've got an understanding with people coming into the courts that we are trustworthy. We are here to help you out. And some of that goes back to what was talked about in the plenary session yesterday morning when the presenter talked about the fact that we're developing relationships with people every time they come into the court. And how we work on those relationships can be very important to this concept of procedural fairness. I did mention, and I've got some additional ones if any of you are interested in, this is an area that the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators have been very concerned about, and they developed, one of the ways that they speak as organizations is through their resolutions. And they developed a resolution a couple of years ago saying that there are a lot of whereas clauses, as you find in most resolutions, but when they get to the resolution itself, they say that the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators encourage their members to take a leadership role promoting the use of procedural fairness principles in the court systems, and further, that to help implement this, they had several action steps. One is to measure litigant satisfaction. How many of us do some kind of satisfaction surveys for people? We've got several hands. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. They say we ought to encourage the integration of research on procedural fairness and effective decision-making into judicial education programs so that judges, magistrates, attorney referees, whatever the quasi-judicial office or position might be in your jurisdiction, that these folks are trained on these issues. That we identify opportunities for judges to obtain honest feedback and mentoring to build self-awareness and continue to develop as leaders in their courtrooms. Judge, you're a presiding judge in your court, and I'm sure that's something that becomes part of the responsibility of presiding judges as well, to have those opportunities for honest feedback with other judges on the bench. Also to practice procedural fairness in the treatment of court personnel. So I found that one very interesting. It was a part where the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators said, this is not just about how we treat the public coming in, but leaders in the court, including judges and court administrators, need to treat our staff with this kind of dignity and respect, and that as we do that, the assumption is that that's going to help raise the level of procedural fairness in the court for everybody. So I just thought this was an important document that sort of outlined these concepts, and I just wanted to share that if you wanted a copy that you can take home with you and have that available. But I don't see this issue of procedural fairness going away anytime soon. I think it's an important part of our landscape. It's something that we're going to hear more about. As more research findings come out on how well we're doing, that's something that we should keep an eye on. And that's why it's built into the curriculum itself, so that you'd have an easy way to get to some resources. There are a lot of other resources that are specifically mentioned in the core competency itself. One of them is highlighted here, the principles for judicial administration. If you're not familiar with this document, as a court manager, I would suggest you look it up online and get a copy and read it. It was developed in 2012 by the National Center for State Courts. It's based on input from courts around the United States, but also some international courts. And it ended up, after this was developed, there was another similar principles for judicial administration that was developed for the international community. So there's a lot of resources that are out there, but part of what this does, and we delve into it more in the full curriculum if you were to take the 15-hour class that goes along with public trust and confidence, is looking at traditional court manager duties and seeing how those are tied in very direct ways with how the public perceives what we do day in and day out, and what we can do as court managers to improve that situation. One of the hardest things, at least in my experience, is dealing with court culture. There's a specific principle that looks at developing organizational culture based on integrity, transparency, and accountability. So what I want to know from all of you is who has developed a surefire way when you onboard new staff members to train them to have integrity, transparency, and accountability? Has anybody figured that out yet? If you have, I want to come to your court and learn from you and see how you've done it. It's difficult to do. Sometimes we talk about how we have to, hire people for personality or some of those basic values, and then we teach them the skills later. I can't teach you to be nice to people when they come into the court. I can teach you how to process a case. I can teach you how to use a computer system. But when we start talking about cultural values that have a direct impact on what we do day in and day out and how the general public looks at us and perceives us, that's another whole ballgame. And I keep trying to find new ways to do that. We work on it, I know, in my jurisdiction in a variety of ways, but I don't know that, I do know. I haven't arrived yet. I keep struggling with that and trying to figure out how to get there. Having a strategic plan that includes a focus on improving public trust and confidence. I've worked on and developed lots of strategic plans over the years, and I can tell you that until I worked on this competency and looked at the core, it never really came into my thinking that there ought to be something specific in our court strategic plan about improving public trust and confidence in the courts. We've got a lot of things on making sure that we've got access to justice, which may overlap it a little bit, or that we have the right resources in the right place, that we're focusing on training for staff and a lot of other things. But think about that one issue that you can have control over as a court manager to say in your court, in your own strategic plan, or whatever governance documents you might have, that we're going to focus on improving public trust and confidence. Just by bringing it into people's awareness throughout the court might help you down that path. So, that's part of the reason I would suggest that you take a look at some of these resources. Ensuring public accountability for court operations and the use of public funds. Did any of you see Jesse Rutledge's session yesterday on the state of the state courts, the surveys? See a few nods, maybe not too many. If you haven't, look for that one on the NACM website. It is really a powerful statement based on a national survey of or registered voters across the country about what they think about the court. And one of the issues is how accountable are we for those taxpayer dollars that are supporting us. That's an issue. People want to know and are concerned about how well we do in that regard. So that's something that we can do. And the idea behind this section in the curriculum itself, even though we don't have the time to do a deep dive into it today, is to think about what we do as court managers systemically, taking the whole range of work that we do. And when I say court managers, Judge, I'm not going to leave you out. In my mind, that includes chief judges or presiding judges, because either by statute or court rule or some other administrative order, they have a certain specific responsibility in the court management world as well. So these are all things that we could learn from, and even just going through and looking at all of the principles that are laid out in this document, you might find that there are several things that you're already doing, that you don't have to work on at all. But there might be other areas that you just hadn't thought about before, and that's one of the benefits of going through and taking a look at this. I'm going to pick on you in just a moment and ask for some input. Kathy's ready with her microphone. But as I mentioned, I'm always struggling with this idea of cultural change and how we can improve that in our courts. So I was just thinking to myself and thinking about what would I do or what have I done over the years. And a couple of the examples I came up with was training existing staff on ethical aspects of court employment. You know, relying on some of the work that NACM has developed with the ethics competency, or some of the video training that Peter Kiefer and others have worked on, Carl Thonis has worked on in terms of, for NACM, on ethical behavior, if you will. That might be something that would help with cultural change. Refocusing recruitment, hiring, and orientation to emphasize a strong culture on integrity, transparency, and accountability. There might be ways to do pre-screening in the hiring process. There might be ways to work questions into interviews, maybe have problem-solving examples rather than just a straight conventional kind of interview as you're looking for new people. Providing opportunities for communication among the staff. How are we doing? Can we do better? What's happened recently? Was there an incident that came up that we need to debrief because we could have done better with it? A lot of courts have adopted an actual code of conduct that includes some of these values about transparency and integrity and others. But I'm curious from all of you because frankly, I do some of these sessions very selfishly. I want to pick your brains at the same time and see what I can take back to Michigan with me after I leave the conference. So it's sort of the Robin Hood theory of court management. So this is your time. Tell me what you do. What kind of approaches do you have to improving the culture in your courts? This is the interactive part. Help me out here. Yes.
In my state, we have, our state court administrator's office has an educational branch.
Yes.
And so I'm constantly on that website looking for training opportunities to send our staff. It serves two purposes. One, they get the training that they need, and two, they get the opportunity to interact with other court staff from other courts that they normally wouldn't interact with, and do what you do, go back and take information from those trainings back to the court and share with other employees.
Great example. Help me out. Give me another one, someone. Yes, please.
So in Los Angeles, we have a court code of ethics. There are 12 tenets to those ethics, and it is
I have to stop you there and just say, I'm impressed that you know that there are 12 tenets to it. I've seen a lot of codes of ethics that folks have gotten and signed off on but never read. So thank you for that. Keep going.
completion of the code of ethics course is part of the core training for all new employees. So there's a set of training classes that all new employees have to complete. And then after you complete it as a new employee, we stress that people complete it every 2 or 3 years, just as a reminder. And then in our monthly staff meetings, we'll typically, take out, one of those tenets and talk about it, and maybe, reenact some things on, customer service and, the difference between giving procedural information and giving legal advice, that kind of thing.
Great examples. I really like the fact that you don't just have folks read it and sign it once, but you go back and encourage people to do it periodically. And the idea of, occasionally taking one of the tenants out and talking about it at a staff meeting or something, great suggestion. Thank you. Please.
I am a senior parish judge from Jamaica. I am from the parish of Westmoreland. So we have monthly staff meetings where persons can air their views, and if they are a little bit timid, we have a suggestion box where you can criticize anybody. Of course, it's anonymous,
Yes.
so we won't know whose handwriting it is if we are that mindful. But certainly you can critique anyone, point out what problems you're having, and it is read out. We go into the box, we take them out, we read them, and we try to address each issue. So we don't know who it is without written something, even to criticize the judge. But it doesn't matter, because we try to deal with the issue for better staff relations.
Great example. So what that also says to me is that there's something that's built into your culture where you're saying to your staff, we value your opinions. and that there's a way to communicate with us so that if there's something that needs to be addressed, we can do that. And it's something, if you have that with staff, that may be something that naturally blends over to litigants that are coming in as well, or other court users. Other examples? One more from, yes, please.
Hi, Frank Hardister, trial court administrator in Michigan, and in our court, we actually worked with National Center for State Courts, and then later worked with SCAO, which is our state court administrative office, to conduct an employee satisfaction survey. So very similar to what some of the comments that have been mentioned already, where it provides that anonymous feedback to court administration and the judges on how we're doing. A word of caution, some of the comments that you get back are quite raw, but it does give you some guidance of areas that we can make improvements on.
Good point. Kathy, I think we had one more example right over here.
Our court administrator and for our circuit in Florida implemented an employee academy. So because we have several different programs, we've got our court reporters, our staff attorneys,
Sure.
our IT, where they all know just what it is that they do. But the employee academy lasts for maybe 6 months, and all staff attended, and that we break down everything from finance and court administration and all the different programs and areas. We teach all of our staff what every other program or department does.
Wow, that sounds very extensive and probably very helpful in terms of having more clued-in employees that even if they're in a different division or do a different task, if they have some knowledge of how the whole system works, they can be better prepared to answer questions from the public when they're coming in. Good example. Any others? All right, well, thank you for those. I'm always looking for ideas that I can borrow or steal and take back and implement myself, so I picked up a couple good ones here. But I think one other thing that I wanted to mention about cultural change that is included in the curriculum is a very interesting assessment instrument that you can use in your own court. It was developed by Brian Ostrom, who is one of the lead researchers at the National Center for State Courts. He wrote this up in an article that appeared a few years ago in the National Center's Trends book. Excuse me. And he talks about court culture, but then looks at it more from a researcher's standpoint and includes a way where you can do an assessment with a series of questions to determine what kind of culture you have, excuse me, in your own jurisdiction. So I would encourage everyone to look at the competency materials, look specifically for that assessment instrument by Brian Ostrom, and if you have questions about culture or how you can improve that in your court, that might give you some actual data that you can work from and move forward from there. So a couple of other things: ensuring public accountability for court operations and the use of public funds. I mentioned different kinds of performance measures that by themselves help with public trust and confidence. We talked about the principles for judicial administration. There are trial court performance measures that many of us have. Some of you are familiar with court tools. Some of you are probably using those, but there are 10 specific measures that you can use and develop information from. Frank, you just mentioned in your comments one of those. It's court tool number 1, or at least that's what the state court office spun off from there. But it looks at access and fairness issues in the courts, and it gives people that are court users an opportunity to give us honest feedback. And I would agree, some of the comments are pretty raw sometimes. I've gotten some of those myself. If you're not familiar with it, after the National Center developed the court tools, they went a step further and developed something called the the high-performance court framework, where there's a quality cycle within courts that's built within the framework itself, and they have a high-performance court framework that is normed for the United States and for courts here. There's another one that is normed for international courts as well. But it's something that it can be easily taken and incorporated into a court strategic plan. It could be incorporated in some of there are aspects of it that could be incorporated in personnel policies that you might have in your court. But there are also, the examples that I tried to pull out usually include some kind of assessment instrument. And there's one example I'm going to give you before we're finished here today. But there are a lot of different assessments, and part of the reason I mention that to you is that in my experience, when you talk about court culture in whatever jurisdiction you're talking about, everybody has some kind of feeling or perception or sense about what the court culture is. And if you've got 100 people on your staff, you've probably got 100 different opinions on what it looks like. What the assessment instruments do is give you some data, something that you can look at where you might find it helpful in terms of understanding where you have issues in different parts of the court or with different staff or whomever, but it helps you with more of data-driven approaches to what are you going to do with cultural changes in your court or where you might have a problem that would be helpful to address. So that's why I would suggest that to you. And one of the, I guess, tools that I included, and I'll give you a few examples from here, and then I'll pass these around for you. But in the competency itself, as with most of the NACM core competencies, you'll find an appendix that follows the curriculum. And in those, there are activities, a variety of activities. So if you're ever looking for something that would help you out at a staff meeting or in a training session or something like that, there are all kinds of activities that are already laid out for you. They've already been tried in different jurisdictions, and you might find them helpful. This is one that is an assessment of public trust and confidence. And it's an example. It has some of the same features as the court tools and some from the trial court performance measures. But there's an activity where you can go through and find out things like finding and getting to the courthouse is easy. How would you rate that? The forms that litigants need are clear and easy to understand. And then you've got sort of a Likert scale that you can go ahead and do that on. One of the things that has been a big issue in our court is security. And there's a basic question for people coming into the courthouse: did you feel safe in the courthouse? And I can tell you I got just as many responses from court staff as I did from the general public on a question like that has caused us to look at a lot of the security that we have, and we're working through a fairly robust security update at this point in time because of the feedback that we got. So I just wanted to let you know that if you are trying to address any of these issues, don't try to do it all on your own. You can if you want to, but there are tools that are already out there that have been developed. And you're going to find a lot of these tools, and this is just one example that I'll send around to you now, of assessment tools that have already been developed. They're easy to administer, they're easy to score, and you can even take it yourself. You might find it interesting to see how you would score your own court, your own jurisdiction. So I just wanted to give that as another practical example of the kinds of things that are built in, not just to the public trust and confidence competency, but in several of them as well. So when we get past the performance measures areas that are built out and looking at this systemic approach to court management, we get into this jurisdictional assessment. And again, what is coming around to you is one of these tools. But as court managers, what this competency recommends to us is that we should be familiar with existing research on public trust and confidence. So again, the 5-year retrospective, the state of state courts that the National Center is publishing now is a good place to start. There might be other assessments like these that you've done, or the court tools #1 that look at access and fairness issues. There are a number of states right now that have different kinds of access to justice commissions or justice for all commissions, looking at, especially for self-represented litigants, how they can better get into the courts. Find out what they're doing in your state. It might be a call to the State Bar Association or to your Supreme Court or the administrative office of the courts, but find out what people are doing in your area and see what you can learn or glean from that information that has already been collected. There's quite a bit that's out there right now. Even though it takes time, planning and implementing a local assessment can be very helpful. There, Frank had mentioned that in Michigan, our Supreme Court has now made this a mandatory performance measure for all courts. So there was a time when a handful of our courts around the state were using the court tools or were using some other kind of assessment instrument to see what the public thought about how we were doing. But now it has developed into a statewide effort, and any of you could go to the Michigan Supreme Court's website, and there's a page on performance measures, and all of our courts' performance measures are published for the world to see. So you can go in and take a look and see how my court's doing if you wanted to. There's an interactive map with all 83 counties in Michigan, and all you have to do is click on the county you're interested in and see how we're doing. The interesting thing to me is folks in the court, like me, are the ones that are obsessing over those performance measures. Some of our judges are obsessing over it when they're in an election cycle, but I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen a lot of the general public pick up on the fact that it's all there and it's available to them. But it is something that's helpful if we are talking with public groups, if we're doing school presentations or things like that, and these kinds of questions come up, being able to point to the fact that you've got some kind of tangible performance measure that lays out how you're being accountable to the general public, how you're using their funds, how you're trying to provide procedural fairness in the court. Those are all things that can be very helpful to you as you go along. So I mentioned this already. I probably got a little bit ahead of myself, but this is from the court tools as one example, measure #1. It's that public satisfaction or access and fairness survey. Again, if you haven't seen it before, it's easily modifiable. You can administer it electronically, or you can do it in person as people are coming in to the courthouse. One of the things that I found a number of courts in Michigan that have done, as we've started doing more surveys, they've used the creative way of bringing students in that wanted to learn something about courts from local government classes and things like that. They administer the surveys and have them available and talk with folks. They're available now in English and Spanish. I don't know if there's plans to make them available in other languages, and the website where you can find those is there. So again, a tool that you can use if you don't have something else that would fit that bill in your jurisdiction. This is one of the things that I'm going to come back. Kathy's going to use the microphone in a minute because I'm interested in seeing what you have used. But when I think about informal assessment opportunities, again, ways that we can learn about how the public relates to us and how we might be able to improve that, some of the things that I know that we've used in our jurisdiction over the years, bench bar meetings. Obviously attorneys are frequent flyers in most of our courts. They have opinions, either theirs or their clients' opinions. So that's helped. There are different law enforcement councils that are out there. Law enforcement agencies are frequently in our courts. And they have strong opinions about what works well and what doesn't work well. Just ask them, and they'll tell you. So, that might be something. School court collaboratives. I heard in one session I was in yesterday, I think it was the Public Information Officers workshop, where they were talking about different kinds of collaboratives with schools where they do mock trials, they do tours of the court. There are people that might go to an individual court to see what we do, and then judges or court staff might go to the school and talk with classes. So that's something. Civic organizations, there are all kinds of opportunities, and they're always looking for a speaker, whether it's the Rotary Club or Kiwanis Club or the Optimist Club, or they are often looking for it, and it may just mean putting ourselves out there and saying we'll come and talk about the courts. But I'm curious, if you're looking at assessments, trying to figure out what the public thinks about our courts, what other kinds of things do you do in your jurisdictions? It's getting late in the day. Peter.
So in Cook County, Chicago.
Here's the microphone for you.
In Chicago, at the Circuit Court of Cook County, we have a grant from the MacArthur Foundation that looks at two things: reducing the jail population and reducing racial disparity in the court.
Okay.
And one of the things we've been doing, it kind of relates to an earlier session that was done, is we've done some listening sessions in the communities, particularly communities where we've had feedback from citizens that are pretty negative about the courts, to try and understand that. So it's kind of an ongoing process, but it's been very encouraging so far.
Good, thank you. That's a good example. So I just want you to think about these things. It doesn't always have to be a formal, heavy lift in terms of projects. There might be other ways where you can quickly assess and informally assess what's going on. The last section in the curriculum itself for public trust and confidence is entitled A Commitment to Excellence. It's trying to look at ways where we can balance a lot of sources of information, look at various ideas about collaborating with the community, and you can see from the learning objective that's over on the left side of the screen, connecting national research on the role of media related to the courts with our experiences in the courts. Sometimes we think we know what we know about the courts, but there may be a big disconnect between us and the general public that we're trying to serve. So trying to figure out how to close that gap with whatever research is out there can be very helpful. So there's some information in Section 7 about that. These were some other examples of community collaborations, looking at tours, Law Day or Law Week activities, mock trials. There are Adoption Day celebrations that often happen in November. Problem-solving court graduations have been one of the big areas where a lot of courts have invited folks from the community into those and really made a big deal out of it. This was one example. There was a short clip from a graduate who talked about the drug court in her jurisdiction saving her life. That's a pretty bold statement about what we do in the courts and how it affects people in the community. So, and then our online accessibility is always an issue as we've got more digital natives coming in to our communities that expect to be able to connect with the courts online. So those are all pieces that can be done. But the end message with this idea of a commitment to excellence is making sure that we're ensuring the procedural fairness that we talked about, that we highlight courts in our message as problem solvers. That's what we do. We problem solve in our communities and help that way. There are surveys that can guide us, focusing on judicial administration not just as a job, but as a vocation, as a calling, as something that is important not only to us personally, but to how we can better inform the community as well and take care of needs there. So I may be out of time here, but I want to recommend that you look at a link. This is a video clip that is identified in the curriculum. It's about 9 minutes long, but it goes through what the state of Washington has done to try to address some of these public trust and confidence issues. And I think it would be worth a look there. So I think I've got a couple minutes left. I just want you to do one more Kahoot with me, if you would. So if you'd open your browsers real quick before we run out of time here. And I'm going to go to number 4 and see if we can play this, and we'll get a number up on the screen in a minute. So we have to get the players lined up first. There's your game number on top. Just enter that into your browser and put in your nickname. And we're starting to come up. We've got Justin, Jem, NACM 2. All right, we got some initials. All right, 14 players so far. We're going to get a few more. Here we go, 17. Any more? Oh, okay, we're waiting for you. All right, we're up to 19. Any others? All right, we'll start there. And here's your question that's loading. Now that I know about the importance of public trust in the courts, what am I willing to do? Are you going to teach the curriculum in your state? You're going to work with judges to convene a bench bar meeting on public trust and confidence? Conduct a public satisfaction survey? Expand your court's strategic plan? What are you willing to do in your court? Wow, there we go. We got quite a range. So we've got some natural teachers in the group that are going to take this and move forward with it. Working with judges, some satisfaction surveys, strategic planning. That seemed to get the highest score. So, my hope was in blending some of these questions in was to get us thinking about what can we do. And rather than just have this be, a educational experience that doesn't go any farther, what is it that we can do to learn from each other? And let's see if I can go back here just for a second. And I used this same slide in the first session, but I think it's important to think about our legacy as we end here today, that everything that we're working on in the courts ultimately gets down to service to the public. How well are we doing that? And sometimes the public trust and confidence competency will help us better understand how we're doing that. So with that, I just want to thank you for being here to be part of the faithful remnant that stayed through the end of the day. And I look forward to seeing you tonight and celebrating at the social event. So thank you very much. And if you've got any questions about any of this, I'll be happy to do my best to answer them. I'll stay around afterwards. Thank you.